Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing our artillery week. And after a couple of presentations, David Patterson on the Monday took us through how a Canadian artillery regiment is set up, how the organisation works, what they did on the approach to Juno Beach and beyond that. And then yesterday we looked at Soviet tank destroyers. Well, today we are off to the Western Desert and May and June 1942. And joining us is the legendary Peter Hart, fresh from a trip to Gallipoli. So, if you don't know who Peter Hart is, you're missing out. He's an incredible First World War and Second World War historian, was heavily involved in the oral histories that were collected by the Imperial War Museum for a long, long time, and now does podcasts and plays in a band and appears on shows like with me. So good evening, Peter. How are you today?
I'm good. Very good. Thank you.
So you've looked at artillery through the lens of one particular regiment, as you've done with infantry, and when you're looking at all the histories you've been privy to for these decades, focusing on one regiment, what does that offer that perhaps focusing at the artillery as perhaps a large organization doesn't do? What do you learn by honing in on a particular regiment?
Well, what you do is you sort of take, but I always use the same analogy, which I'll briefly use it. That gives you, one person gives you that, two people give you that, and if you're finally, if you've got 30 people or 40 or 50, then you get a complete picture with hopefully no holes in it. Now, the point about it is that gives you. If you're talking about the point of doing the same unit is if you're talking about a Stuka attack, you're talking about the same Stuka attack. If you're talking about a tank attack, if you're talking about Knightsbridge, if you're talking about El Alamein, if you're talking about when they went back to England, if you're talking about the Northwest Europe campaign, whatever you're talking about, they're all talking about the same thing. So therefore, you can compare and contrast their experiences and make a sort of rational decision. Now, sometimes people are out on a limb. And you, as a historian, it's not your job as an oral historian to tell them they're liars or wrong. It's your job to record it. It's a historian's job to decide whether the outline quote is wrong, these are loony or whatever, or it's right, and the others are wrong. And sometimes you get to, everybody hates an officer, and then someone says, no, I liked him, and then gives a reason. You think, well, that's interesting. That means he perhaps wasn't such a bad officer, but he was a bit strict, or whatever.
Yeah.
So
and the other thing about artillery that David talked about Monday is in the effectiveness of artillery, a lot of maths is involved. I mean, it is angles and trigonometry and optics, things like that. And there's a lot of calculations to get fire on targets. But that's really, as key as that is, not everybody involved with a regiment such as the one you write about are involved in that. Some of them are just sitting behind a gun, pressing the button when they're told to, loading the shell when they're told to, and the mathematics bit is left to others. So in understanding artillery, of course, that maths aspect is very important, but does that sometimes mean that you're missing what the actual gunner is going through, and the gunner is in a much more personal war?
Yes. The ACs, they call them ACs. They had artillery assistants who generally were well educated and understood trigonometry, something, by the way, which I don't. I doubt historians don't tend to be good at maths. They play a vital role, but so does everybody else in the regiment. They'll not go far without a cook. They'll not go far without the medic. So the point is to interview everybody and see how they work together, what everybody's role. But most of all, you put your finger on it. It's the chaps on the gun that are sort of at the sharp end, and of course the people at the OP post, which are even further forward and often forgotten about. The observation post, which in the Western Desert by this time is mobile. Marmon Harrington's at the top, which I'd never heard of until I read it there. I must have known what it was 5 years ago.
One of the older antiquated armoured cars.
Well, if you fired one of them said somebody accidentally fired a rifle. It went not only through the skin of the armor, it went through the heavy duty battery the other side of it. I gave them no confidence in what it would do to it, how it would resist a shell. Wow. But yeah, so it's that part of thing. And you try and interview a mix, but you try and interview officers, you try and interview NCOs, signalers, you try and interview everybody. They won't get far without signalers either. Do you see what I mean?
Signals is important. So, Peter, I'm going to throw up a map of a bit of North Africa there, middle of the summer 1942. So, take us through the events leading up. We're going to be focusing on the Battle of Knightsbridge, which is part of the Battle of Gazala, but set the scene of what had been happening in the previous months for the regiment, and who are we talking about, and where did they come from?
Well, the regiment are the South Notts Hussars, and they're 107th Royal Horse Artillery. I think they call themselves Royal Horse Artillery. Often artillery call them Royal Artillery, but there you go. They were a territorial regiment from Nottingham, as their name implies. They've been sent out to Palestine, and then they've gone to Mersa Matruh. Then they've been involved in the late 1940 December operations against the Italians. They've then been involved in defending the canal, the Suez Canal. Then they'd moved on. And then the big thing, they were in Tobruk. They were in Tobruk throughout next to 1st RHA, which a link that, by the way, continues this very day. They helped. They were vital. It was the guns that kept. I mean, everybody played their role. Of course, the Australian division, all the infantry, everybody plays their role, but the guns are crucial. And that was like their big. They got to the end of that and they thought, "Phew, it's all over." It's like their Battle of the Somme. They thought. Little did they know that their Battle of the Somme lay ahead of them. And that's the point. Now, after Tobruk had been relieved in the back end of 1941, they moved forward all the way to El Aguila, which is probably on that map. No, it's not. It's further to the left, or west, as we historians call it. But then the whole geo situation had changed. The Japanese came into the war. That sucked in a lot of North African reinforcements. The Rommel had been reinforced, and a series of counterattacks had thrust back the Allies, the North, the 8th Army to the Gazala Line, which is that map there. What happened there? Well, the South Notts Hussars weren't there at first. They were rebuilding. They'd changed. They'd been attached to the 22nd Armoured Brigade. I better tell you who that is, because it gives people a sense of who they are. That was the tanks of the 2nd Royal Gloucesters, the 3rd County of London, 4th County of London, and the 50th Reconnaissance Regiment. And they were back in Egypt, and they were basically training the new box system, training all that. They're also adding a battery. So there's 425 battery, 426 battery, and 520 battery. Now, they were, if you look at the map in front of you, which you probably can't see, they were moved up and they came to stop around about the Knightsbridge box, which is right in the center of that map. By coincidence, I expect. And here they were caught up in the Rommel's great offensive. Now, Rommel's offensive is, Rommel, it's quite simple. The Italians would batter themselves against the box system that you can see, 1st, 2nd South African, 1st South African, 151 Brigade, etc. They batter themselves against them, while the 15th and the 21st Panzer Division would swing right round the right and then come round the back and try and do for the 7th and 1st Armoured Divisions. The result of this is they catch the South Notts Hussars unawares. And literally, the interviews are full of, people playing chess, just sitting around, no idea what's coming. And this is on the 27th, the night of the 26th, 27th of May. And on the 27th of May, they strike. Now, I'm going to read the occasional quote, if that's all right with you.
Please do.
Yeah. What happens is Lance Sergeant Harold Harper is sent out, and then with his officer, who's Jerry Birkin. They're in 2 separate Marmon Harringtons, and I interviewed both. I'll tell you why I didn't interview Jerry Birkin in a while, if you see what I mean. But Bombardier Bobby Feekins was in the Marmon Harrington with Birkin, and this is what he said. He was talking. So Jerry Birkin was up through the turret, looking out of the back of the turret, facing the Germans. The next round came straight into the armoured car. I didn't realise it had hit us, and I turned, and there were the two radio operators without heads, absolutely nothing from the shoulders. I had blood and muck all over me. Jerry, that's Jerry Birkin, slumped into my arms, and he was actually dead at that point, hit right in the abdomen. I was wounded in the legs. On the inter-battery radio, I said, "We've been hit! We've been hit!" Now, he then said, "I was bleeding profusely from shrapnel fragments all round my legs, and I decided to make it back to the battery to get out of a sitting duck position." I said to the chap, I didn't even look round. "Hang on!" I slammed it into gear to try and get out of a sitting duck and get back. I tried to get my foot on the accelerator because I was losing the strength in my legs, and I hit a slit trench. It just went whoom, straight in. I can assure you it was a nasty smack. I turned around and there was nobody there. I wondered what had happened. I crawled out as best I could, pulling myself out, and I was hanging on the back of the vehicle when Sergeant Harper came racing across to me. I suppose I was in a bit of shock. Headless bodies. The inside of my armoured car was just nothing but blood and flesh, bits of body all over the place. So that's one account by a very, I mean, he was damaged. I mean, he never recovered his health. I mean, he was quite ill. I mean, he lived to be 90, but he was... Anyway, Sergeant Harold Harper, Lance Sergeant Harold Harper, he's in the other Marmon Harrington. He comes racing across. And he says this: "I've never seen anything like it in my life. Major Jerry Birkin lay flat on the floor, obviously dead. I went to the back, opened up the two doors at the back of the armoured car. Apparently, the armour-piercing shell had gone clean through the middle of the battery commander as he was standing up, and then chopped off the heads of the two radio operators. All he could see was these two lads, their hands still holding their mouthpieces, although their heads had rolled onto the floor. A bit of a gory sight." That's an understatement for you there, Paul. Wow. "My biggest problem was to persuade Captain Ivor Birkin," that's who was the officer in his Marmon Harrier, "to leave his brother. He was in a very distressed state." And that, I think, there you go. OP duty isn't safe, is it? Especially not if you run into the best part of a German armoured division. Coming down, you know, that it's incredible scene. And they have such adventures, Birkin and Harper. Obviously, I can't go into them now. We've got to crack on. But basically, they then surprise the back. They don't manage to get reports off, and they surprise 520 battery in the desert. And I love one story from a chap called Bill Hutton. And he'd got a permanent lavatory seat he'd made out of some bit of wood. And he sat on that. Actually, it was from a petrol can. So I remember sat opposite looking at him thinking, I wouldn't sit on a petrol can. I'd be worried about cuts, but never mind. Anyway, wow. He was sat on it reading. And then suddenly there's bits of stone, he thought, landing all around him. And he thought, some bugger's shooting at me. He's shooting at me. Hey, you bastards. You know, that kind of thing. And then he sees a tank way on the horizon. And then he realizes the tank's shooting at him. And it's got bloody great iron crosses on it. You know, later on he said, if only he'd been Errol Flynn with his sticky bombs, he could have put it out of action. And then he thought, thank goodness I'm not Errol Flynn. But they were totally surprised. Before they could do anything, the tanks were all over them. They didn't know what to do. They were too late. And one of the officers I interviewed, he always said, I remember his name, Herbert Bernella. He said, when do you go and when do you stay? How do you know what to do? Do you go now or do you that would be deserting, or do you stay and fight? But they end up doing neither, really, and they're overrun. And the scene then moves. This is all happening on the 27th of May. Sorry, I'm talking too much. Just pitch in if you want to.
I just wanted to just jump in quickly and just say, when we talk about the desert campaign, and we did on this channel ourselves, end of last year, and we talked for 2 weeks about the Battle of El Alamein. There is, of course, lots of talk about the grand strategy and Rommel and Montgomery and how they're using artillery as an arm, how they're using combined arms. Is the air support being used the correct way? Those discussions are fascinating. I enjoy having them. Some people are very, very qualified at talking about them, but there's nothing quite like getting into the weeds of just a unit of artillery pieces in the middle of the desert, who have tanks suddenly coming out at them, because all of that overview stuff really doesn't matter when you're a guy there in a Marmon Harrington armored car as an OP, and you see, you know, tanks coming at you with iron crosses on the sides. That use of artillery is the last thing you're thinking about. That, you know, have we got our doctrine right? That's not what you're thinking at that point, is it? You're thinking about, am I going to get killed?
Yeah, it's exactly what you're thinking. You've got no. I mean, as it happens, if you want to talk doctrine, artillery should never be on its own. They're almost helpless. They should always be with tanks. They should be with more artillery, because artillery is powerful in mass units, and they should most of all be with infantry. And they weren't any of these situations. Then they move on, and then they attack 425 and 426 battery. And I come from Chesterfield, and there was a guy called Ted Holmes I interviewed, and he was the old grave digger from one of the churches up on the hills behind Chesterfield. And I went to see him, and he still lived up there. He'd only just retired, and he told me all about grave digging as well. That was interesting. But he also gave an account of what happened when the tanks were rolling towards them, and they were holding the fire to the last minute. Now, Paul, can you have a little think about what might be the disadvantage when facing a tank of holding fire to the last minute? Remembering what tanks are armed with.
Well, it's the coaxial machine guns as well, isn't it? I mean, there's the big gun in the turret, but there's also the machine guns as well. And also, if the Germans are using the tanks properly, there could well be infantry there as well who could overrun. So there's a whole lot of problems about letting German tanks get near you, not least of which the tank itself. But I say machine guns, infantry. Yeah,
spot on. They didn't have infantry in this occasion because it's a raid. It's they're coming round as on the map. But this is what Ted Holmes says, because eventually they do open. He says, I won't pretend to do a Derbyshire accent because I can't do it, even though I'm from there. If you hit him, will do. No, that's generic Northern, isn't it? I won't. If you hit him, it's okay. But meantime, he's firing at you with his gun and machine gunning you at the same time, twisting and turning, zigzagging towards you. We got one or two shots off when this one hit us. I believe it was an 88mm from a tank. Well, they always think it's 88mm. There was such a lot of velocity with them that the first you knew about them was when it had hit you. It dropped just underneath the gun shield, as far as I know. I was on the left-hand side of the gun, where you load up with your right hand. He was a loader. Crouched down, my head right under the gun layer's seat with its 25-pound round. I should have said they had 25 pounders. Well, never mind. Ready to load up again. It was just like someone had given me a big bang on the shoulder. My arm went all dead. It was just like a piece of old rope, just hanging all sort of any road. You could see the bones through me flesh. I reeled away. And that's the reality. I mean, you can have it explained why not to let tanks too close to you, or you can listen to Ted Holmes. He'll tell you why you shouldn't let it get too close to you, because you'll get very badly wounded. His arm he showed it me. It was still, I mean, it was badly damaged. But he survived. So, that in a sense is almost the story of the 27th. There's loads of other interesting. One of my favorites was when the regimental history, it said, though the car drew intense enemy fire, Gunner Worley coolly changed the wheel under a hail of small arms fire. And what actually happened was he was told to change the bloody wheel. And he says, Ted Whittaker was the one who left. Machine guns were landing around us. All a bit of a rattle. If they'd been any closer, they'd go through it. You can imagine. We couldn't get the spare wheel off. I don't know whether it was because we were terrified or if the nuts were tight. Talk about fingers and thumbs. We finally got the spare wheel off. Then jacking up an armoured car. It's heavy. We were frantic. We got this ruddy wheel off. We put 2 wheel bolts on, and Dave said to me, "What do you reckon? In the bloody car." We opted in. The major said, "Okay," and off we went. And then when they stopped later on, and they had a look, they'd cross-threaded both of the nuts to the wheel. And that's what the official history call coolly changed the tyre.
Coolly changed the tyres, yeah.
But that's a thing to remember. Regimental history's taught bollocks, because they have a purpose in life, and that is that everything that ever happened to the regiment is perfect. And that's what oral history it doesn't undercut it, but it brings you more of a reality. And reality for me is quite important in understanding war. You need to know what it was really like, not coolly change it under fire, that kind of thing.
Well, this is the thing, you without saying that you've lived a long time, you're older than me, but you're not old, but you have been through the phase of historiography. Because, like me, I read the kind of the regimental histories that were published in 46 and 47, and death is often kind of overlooked a little bit, apart from the roll of honor at the back, and everything just seems to go very well. We're reading about infantry or armor. They're a record of service without really trying to bring up any demons, aren't they? And then then people like yourself then go and meet the guys, and the guys start, if they want to open up, start revealing you that some of these things that get a bit of a dull description in the regimental history actually were really, really tense moments of absolute horror.
Absolutely, and they're partly based on the regimental diary, but regimental diaries are, some people swear by them. I swear at them, because they are entirely written. They're written by the adjutant or the intelligence officer, and their main function is to make sure that no blame attaches to the colonel for anything that happens. In the Great War, that's why units always retreat. The unit on the right retreats and we conformed. And that's that principle of, it's never us.
Yeah.
Anyway, so shall we move on to the next bit of the battle? Because the 27th of May is the first part. And now we move to what that picture depicts, which is the 6th of June. Now, what happened here is Rommel, he'd actually been in trouble. He'd been sort of trapped in the Cauldron. He was, to use a highly technical term, buggered. It appeared, and so what he does is turn round and attack the boxes to the west of him. Turning his back on the 8th Army, breaks through the box, and then supplies and everything else come through that gap, and that leaves a very strong force in the Cauldron. Sadly, High Command doesn't know this, British High Command, and they're planning their own offensive. This is Operation Aberdeen. It's going to be carried out on the night of 4th, 5th June. Big barrage, and the 10th Infantry Brigade, 5th Indian Division, and the 22nd Armoured Brigade are going to push west directly into the Cauldron and then break through, blah, blah. And then there was going to be a tank attack, 32nd Army Tank Brigade attacking from the north. Finally, the 7th Army, then everybody will pile through, and we'll all have tea in Berlin, that kind of attack. What goes wrong is everything. It's just awful. And they fire the barrage at an empty desert because they're not there. And then when they move forward, they sort of run straight into the Afrika Korps in strength. The lads, when they describe it, they all describe it as an arc of fire on the horizon, as all these guns and tanks open up, and they've got infantry with them, and they've got bloody Stokers as well. It's just awful. And that night, the night of the 5th, 6th, they sort of go to bed, and the terrible thing is that their brigade commander, William Carr, tells them that they have to stand and fight to the last round. And the person that he tells, according to him, and he's a very dubious source, is Major, he was a brigadier in later life, Robert Daniel. And he was told to stand and fight, and he takes it literally, except for himself, of course. Now, next morning, they're in the Cauldron. The tanks have withdrawn overnight. Paul, you'd have expected nothing else. They always do. Retire to harbour. That's not a criticism. The infantry, the Indians are somewhere about, but essentially there's 425, the remnants of 520 and 426 battery are in the Cauldron. You don't really need to know their exact positions. It's all in a book, but what you need to know is that they're there. And this is what Sergeant Ray Ellis, who, by the way, is the chap with the bare back, I think, on that. In that picture you've got, and he says this. He's a 425 battery. He says, I was standing by the gun when two figures approached, Captain Slynn and Lieutenant Geoffrey Timms. They stopped for a chat, and I asked, what's the situation, sir? Captain Slynn said, we're being left to fight a rear guard, Sergeant. We're going to stop, and it's one of those fight to the last man and last round jobs. It's going to be a bloody awful day, a real hell of a job, this one. I think there will be very few of us left alive at the end of this day. And Graham Slynn was indeed, both those officers were killed in the fighting that followed, in unpleasant circumstances to boot. So next day, 6th of June, dawn comes and the Stukas fly over the battlefield. And I didn't know this, but the German recognition signals from artillery and infantry were purple. And all round, seemingly, the South Notts Hussars, these purple smoke signals went up. And can you imagine how they felt? These guys, you've got to realise that they're not 68 or you a very young 42 like yourself. They're actually, what, 20? They've been out there for a while, 21, 22. You know, most of them in that bracket, 23, 24. And do you know what? This looks like curtains, doesn't it? Yeah. I think possibly, I think we could play a tape when the tanks start rumbling towards them. One of the best, we're looking at him now, but if you could play the tape by Ray Ellis.
The one about targeting tanks.
About targeting tanks. And then we could look at this picture and see what he means.
Okay, here we go, folks. Yep.
When you're actually firing at tanks which are approaching, you take scant notice of the tank you've just fired at because you're looking at the next and you're very excited. Again, it depends where the shell hits the tank. If it hits it on the track, you're going to blow the track off, isn't it? Obviously. And the tank will slew and stop. That means you can put another one into it and set it on fire because he's slewed round and you bring him, or get him, and you pull him round, bang one in the back of him and he'll hit him and he'll explode and brew up. But by this time there's probably, you can see somebody's coming over from the ledge getting close to you, so you whip the gun round, have a go at him. Sometimes you'll fire the shell and the tank it'll explode, hit the tank, and the tank would keep coming. You'd probably hit him on the turret with a high explosive shell. It's probably given everybody in the tank a headache, but it didn't stop the tank or kill them all, and they could keep coming. You'd carry on firing, but you see, you're not just firing at one tank. You think, I better have a go at him, he's getting a bit close. You pull your gun round and have a go at another one. All you're looking at, to be absolutely honest, all you're looking at are the few tanks that are coming near your gun. And all you're thinking about is not saving the British Empire. All you're thinking about is protecting your gun and yourself and knocking out any tanks that look dangerous to you.
Paul.
How brilliant is that? I mean, just amazing recording. And yeah, the first thing that strikes you, again, from what we talked about with David Patterson, is, you know, we talk about the theory of artillery, indirect fire, direct fire. There's the big debate about tank destroyers. When is a tank destroyer a tank hunter? When does it become an assault gun? When you're bearing down looking down the bore sighting pretty much a 25-pounder at German tanks or Italian tanks coming at you over the horizon, the last thing you're thinking about is how your regiment is being deployed in terms of the doctrine of artillery. It just becomes a battle of nerves, in a sense.
It does. And these guys had to fight it out. At 9:30 that morning, the Colonel William Bill Seeley, always known as Bill to the lads as well, sent a message to Brigadier Carr, again asking permission to withdraw. And Carr again tells them to bug off, which is just appalling, you know, in the sense of what good are they doing? He tells them a relief force, a 32nd Army Tank Brigade, is coming. But they're not coming because they can't make any progress against this fire either, because this is not an isolated incident. Because this is something I should make clear. This is not the only artillery unit trapped in the desert in this bit. This is a whole disaster for 3 or 4 artillery units and that Indian Brigade. Let's not forget them. They're also under attack. It's a bloody disaster in every way. They're in basically a saucer, and the Germans are occupying the rim of the saucer. Well, Cauldron gives you a bit of a hint. And it's awful. The medical arrangements in the book, I go into that. It's just bloody awful. The medical orderly I interviewed was tending to someone when he had his head blown off. You know, he sees an airburst hit Slynn and Timms. You know those 2 officers, and he actually gives them he's a bit funny about it. He gives them a lethal dose of morphine on the doctor's instructions because he said they were not going to get better from it. They were dying definitely, and they didn't have. It's a brutal form of triage, that I'll tell you. I'm not now. What time? Yeah, we're doing well for time. Can I give you another couple of quotes from Ray Ellis? I'll read them. So you have to
just before you do, just because the geeks are out in force, and that's fine. They're asking, are the 25-pounders on their platforms, or are they kind of in the sand, like dug in?
They're on their platforms.
And the other question was about HE or armor piercing. Do they have both or either? What are they using at this point?
They have both, but they reckon cap on is more effective.
Right. Okay.
High explosive with a cap on is how they often fire it. I have to admit, not fellow geeks, because I'm not a geek. It's a long time since I wrote this book, and the detail has. Do you know what I was doing at the National Army Museum today? Sudan, 1898. Do you see what I mean? Sometimes
you were literally in Gallipoli last week for the first one. Now you're back to late 19th century, and then today you're going World War II. So you're multi-warring it over a matter of a few days.
I'm multi-whoring it, yes. But it's a bit of a gear change, and so you'll have to bear with me if I struggle a bit. They were on platforms, according to everybody I saw. It's probably not in this painting.
No, you can't really see.
That's a Cuneo. There should be a mouse on it somewhere, firing a little tank. I can't actually pick it up at the moment. It's somewhere on there.
Yeah, that came up in the sidebar, Terence Cuneo, because he normally did railway paintings, didn't he? And then he always used to put a little mouse on the track, didn't he?
And he always puts a mouse. There is a mouse on this. I think it's in the middle to the right, just right of the wheel.
People will be straining their eye to see it now. And by the way, folks, I should recommend that both there are two books that Peter has written about this. There's the regimental one, and the big wartime one, and then there's the older one you wrote about the action in the desert, isn't there?
Mainly, it was really very concentrated on the desert. Yeah, the other one is at close range, which is that whole
close range.
time.
Yeah, link is in the description below, folks. Definitely go and get it. Fantastic. But yeah, let's hear some more quotes of those who are involved in this.
Well, let's try Ray Ellis again, because I did about 30 or 40 reels. It's probably available at the War Museum. Type in Ray or Raymond Ellis, ELLIS, and IWM, and you'll see whether it's available. He said this: the air was just alive with red-hot steel. I remember hitting a Mark IV tank, and it slewed round and burst into flames. The next thing I was in the air, as if somebody had picked me up and thrown me in the air, spinning in the air. We'd had a direct hit on the gun. I dropped, woof, onto the ground. I lay there a second or two, dazed, and then before I picked myself up, I went up spinning in the air again and dropped again. This time, I think I was unconscious for a short time. And when he came round, he says this, and this is his mates. He's a gun sergeant. These are his gun detachment. My gun was upside down, and the crew were draped on the floor all around. I thought I must be wounded, but I couldn't feel anything. My shirt and body were all black. My clothes were all blood-stained, and I was in a hell of a state. I realised the only one to have survived. The whole crew had been killed. My next thought, was for self-preservation. A very strong instinct. Get your head down, Ray. And then later, he just, I'm sorry. I tend to tell this story through him because he is the best. When you do oral history, you tend to do 50 interviews. Yeah. And 5 of them are the ones that you end up using most. And Ray Ellis was exceptional. He said this with a great. He sees a shell take out the number 1 gun section nearby, and he may be self-preserving, but he's also got a sense of duty, and he gets up and goes towards the gun to man it. He says this: with a great deal of reluctance, I got out of my hole and went over to number 1 gun. The gun was in a parlous state. The shield was all riddled. At least one of the tires was flat, but it was workable. Other people must have noticed, because from somewhere men started to appear. They were signallers or specialists or drivers, but they helped to man the gun. These men were not gunners, but they could tell. But you could tell them what to do, and they're still under heavy fire. And he says this: as one man was mown down, then somebody else appeared. I remember a man from the Royal Corps of Signals coming on the gun position in the late afternoon. This man caught a burst of machine gun fire right in the bottom part of his body. He jumped in the air, an instinctive muscle movement. Then he fell to the ground. I looked at this lad and he was frightened. His eyes were terrified. I crouched down to try to console him with all the noise going on around. You're all right, lad. You're all right. Don't worry. You're not badly wounded. We'll soon have you away. I reckon you've got a blighty. Trying to ease his fear. While I was talking, I noticed the sand was settling on his eyes. He was dead. He died in my arms. Now, I remember him telling me that. And yeah, he may have exaggerated for effect. You know, I'm not dumb enough to believe everything I'm told. But at the time, I think it happened pretty well like that. That's what I think. And it was quite emotional listening to the man himself who did that talking to you.
And just a question about when you were taking these interviews, and you did First World War, Second World War. When you were conducting them, was it quite instant for you to realize this guy is not going to be very good, or conversely, this guy is going to be amazing? Was it something you would get used to very quickly, whether it was going to be a classic one or one of the ones this will be interesting, I'll just go in the archive? How quickly could you recognize?
Very quickly. I mean, because when you get there, we chat to them about their garden. I always have a cup of coffee with them, settle them down, tell them what we're doing, tell them about the copyright, tell them that they should keep the copyright and only give it to the War Museum on death. War Museum loved that about me, because I don't believe oral history should be on the internet while people are alive. And then we start with a background growing up, and that way you get used to that. They get used to it. So when you reach instants like that, they're good. I can't remember how many he did, but he did about 15 hours on being a prisoner of war.
Wow.
He was in the Blue Flame farting things. Do you know that? And he was a wrestler. Oh, Blue Flame farting. I'll leave you to work it out. Lighting your farts.
Yeah.
And he was a wrestler in the camp because he's a big, well set up lad, was Ray Ellis. And I mean, he was very important to me. I've got a couple more. One last one finishes that, and then we'll have one last one right at the very end because we've got more to discuss than this. Because there's a huge cock up at the end. Ray Ellis said this: "I was left with just one man on the gun. Everyone else had been killed. He was a complete stranger. I don't know who he was or where he'd come from." This is about the time shown on the gun. On the picture. "I just fired a shell when I heard a machine gun, which sounded as if it was a few inches behind me. It sounded so close. This man was just splattered against the inside of the gun shield. I looked behind. I could see the tank within 20 to 30 yards behind me, with the machine gun still smoking. I tensed myself and waited for this burst of fire, which never came. I shall never know whether the gunner had compassion, run out of ammunition, or saw something that distracted him. I like to think he had compassion. I'd like to think. I think he'd probably run out of ammunition." The position is gradually they're encircled, and Colonel Seeley, Bill Seeley, his men had nothing but admiration for him. He was moving around the gun positions. He had a honey tank. They're also useless, but and eventually a shell had a direct hit. It caused fire, and he was burnt to death. Just one member of his crew. Well, I don't think there's many in a honey, are there? Now I've got to tell you the finish of the story. How are we doing? Yeah, we're doing fine.
You're fine.
The finish of the story for me is interesting because this is where you make a remark like you've got to fight to the last round to a man like Major Robert Daniel, and he's not going to surrender under any circumstances. And what he did, he was a regular officer in a territorial unit. He had no time for the South Notts Hussars. He was second in command, but he was basically a bit of an arse. A distinguished officer, no doubt, but the South Notts don't like him. And this is why. He determined that he would try and stay. And he said this. I normally do this in a Brigadier Bloodknock voice, and I think I will because I think it sums him up. We'd been told to stand and fight to the last man and the last round, and that's what we did. I was directly given the order, and I had no idea of surrender at all. My natural inclination had been to move the whole bloody lot half a day earlier and get them out of trouble. I never would order anybody to surrender, and no horse artillery gunner officer has ever surrendered. That, I think, is bollocks, by the way. He then goes on to say, and this is what killed a lot of people, I knew that the guns behind me had no ammunition. I knew that Barber's battery, that's 426 battery, had got ammunition. If I could get guns to it, if I could get the 4 guns together, I could face 4 ways. I could therefore stop any tank from running over them. You must remember, I'd seen a German tank run right over the British gun. I found these 2 guns and shouted to them to follow me. I was in my 800-weight truck, and I started to drive off towards Barber's position. I never saw them again. Now, the accent changed a lot during that, I noticed.
Wave it a bit, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the trouble is, I think he meant that. He drives off, no one follows him, so he drives off into the desert. He's one of the only ones to escape. Think of it what you will. I suppose for him, I would say he was determined to escape, and he did. The men behind him tried to follow his orders to form this British square, which is what he's bloody on about, a square. And I now introduce you to Signaller Ted Whittaker. And this quote will make your toes curl, I think. He was 45 battery, and he says this. He was from Nottingham, but when I interviewed him, he was in Leicester. There was ammunition exploding, gun limbers and ammunition trucks blowing up, flames, smoke, horrible stink of gunpowder. I went to E Troop. I thought if this was it, I might as well be with my mates. Major Daniel drove up and shouted, "Form British Square! Go and form up on 46 battery!" They were over to our right. I rushed up when I heard this, and the gunners, they got their quads, which are still in action. That's the gun towers. And they hooked the guns in. I went to get on the limber of the first gun in the troop. There were two, remember he was a signaller. There were 2 or 3 chaps sitting on the limber. The nearest one, Harrison, was a Derby County footballer. He told me to fuck off. Did you know that your grandfathers used to swear, children? The truck was moving, and I grabbed hold of the door, put 1 foot on the footrest, so I was hanging up at the side of the door. We went a few yards, and there was the most horrible... I glanced round, couldn't quite see what had happened. There was some awful moans at the back. The most enormous crash brought us to a standstill. As I jumped off, I looked back, and it was a terrible sight. The first shell had hit these blokes. This poor Harrison was practically in half. I dropped off the door and threw myself flat. The driver, Stevenson, he'd got half out of the door, and the next armor-piercing shell came straight through the driving cab, and there was poor Stevenson left hanging over the door. I was absolutely horrified at what had happened to these people I had been talking to only a moment before. I felt I could have sat down and cried. And Daniel's gesture gets these people killed. They should have surrendered. When tanks are on the position, there's no point. They're not going to do any damage to anybody.
Yeah.
And he just drove off to 426 and then drove off further.
Just to play devil's advocate for a second, Peter.
Yes, certainly.
When you're I've never been in any kind of near-death situation like this, but you, as a commander,
you should come to Gallipoli. You get it all the time.
But whether you're commanding a regiment or a battery or a gun, you're trying to balance. That there was that sense of defending to the last round, and you're kind of trying to convey the desperation to people. And then, of course, practically, you do get to a point where surrender would probably be the logical option. But if you built people up to this, let's not give in. I can kind of understand why in the situation people do carry on, even when practically they shouldn't, because you've got people kind of to a pent up. Does that make sense to you?
It does, and I would say that that's the attitude of Whittaker and Harrison and the rest of them. They're following orders. The one who wanders off is Daniel. That's the perception of he didn't help. He just drove off. And that's why, I mean, I think it's probably unfair. He is an extremely distinguished and highly thought of officer in some circles, not in South Notts circles. This is what Captain William Pringle, he was I loved him. He was this bad-tempered, miserable Scot. Now, you might say to me, all Scots are bad-tempered and miserable.
But
But
I would never say such a thing.
And nor would I. I would have challenged you if you'd said that. This is what Captain William Pringle, 426 Battery. I have to say aye before it. Aye. The tanks were nearly on top of me. They were so close behind me that there was no more ammunition. He misses that out. Left to fire. We left the last 2 rounds to blow the gun up. You put one down one end and one up the other and pull the trigger. And that's a far more pragmatic attitude, I think. They're actually on the gun position when these incidents happen. They're not sort of coming up. They're on the gun position. Now, the next, I think we've got another quote from Ray Ellis. If we could play that.
This is about the end of the battle. Yeah, we'll play that now.
Yeah, we'll play that, and then we'll talk about a few of them surrendering, because that's all part of the story.
Okay, here we go.
First thing I did, I was very, very thirsty, and I walked over to the armoured vehicle that Peter Birkin had. He was no longer in it, but in it were the bodies of the driver and Jim Hardy. And as he lay, Jim Hardy had been cut in two, actually, but his water bottle was sort of hanging there. And I remember getting my knife and cutting his webbing, taking this water bottle and drinking this lukewarm water, old Jim's bottle. And I looked down at his lifeless face and I just burst into tears. Reaction, I suppose. And the fact of seeing him, an old pal from the day I'd joined the regiment almost, just a bit. That I didn't lay out there sobbing for him. I can remember that did actually burst into tears.
Now, I found that quite moving. And because I've heard lots about Jim Hardy. They called him Nelly. He was a bit of an old woman, but a great, looked after his lads, fantastic, great sense of humour. And that's what I try and do. I try and work these characters in. And you don't give any clue that they're going to die until bloody hell. And that's what war's like. You go into action and you're all mates together, and then suddenly 2 of you are dead. And you've got to think about what's happening. It's a terrible business. It is a terrible business.
And I think that's what's so good about oral histories, and so good about, if I may offer you some praise, the way you write about it, is that when you speak to veterans, they can change the tone of a sentence on a sixpence. They will say, "Oh, there was Bill. He was a funny old guy. We used to go and and he got killed a week later." And they will change the emotion mid-sentence. Whereas, of course, in a more conventional narrative history, where you're talking about a regiment, you kind of build up. Here's the training part. You don't do those kind of 180s normally in that kind of history. But with oral histories, that's how they go. They will just suddenly throw in a funny moment preceded by a boring moment, and then followed up by an incredibly dramatic moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, oral history. I mean, the thing is, you've got to decide what you believe and what you don't believe, and that's really important. Is it all true? Is everything, all the quotes I've told you, all true? I thought they were. What else can I do? One of my favourite things is, in my humble opinion, well, who else's bloody opinion are you going to have? I mean, it's just ridiculous. I think anyone who puts IMHO, if anyone's put it in the comments, then bugger off. You can only have one opinion, and that's yours, basically. Here's a quote leading up to the surrender. Perhaps we'll talk a bit about, and this is Sergeant Fred Langford. He was the headquarters at 425 Battery, and he said, when things became completely silent, you could hardly hear yourself speak because of the silence. The Jerrys came out and told us to gather together in a little group. The standard remark was, "Hard luck, Englander. For you, the war is over," in a guttural tone, of course. The thing that hurt my ego was they wanted the acorn cap badge. Well, always causes trouble with the South Notts Hussars. They're obsessed with the acorn. They call themselves the Acorn Gunners. I took my cap badge off. That's how I lost my cap badge. One chap was shot just like that because he virtually told the jury, demanding it, to get stuffed. I'm afraid I'm no hero to that extent. And one of the officers he refused to hand it. He didn't cooperate, and he was shot. I can no longer remember his name. Sorry about that. But now, I mean, how many were killed? Well, it 76 were killed in the Battle of Knightsbridge. The 16 more died from wounds, and most of there were about 500 in total strength, and most of the rest ended up prisoners. The main group of people who didn't were the supply sector people, or people who'd been sent away from the unit. One thing interesting that I found interesting is the territorial, but you could see the regiment changing. So when they join it, all the officers are knobs, to use a technical term.
Yep.
They are the local gentry. It's a yeomanry regiment. But by this time, the best of the lads, what they call the Nottingham Grammar School boys, have been picked on. They've been promoted to sergeant, and a lot of them miss Knightsbridge because the first batch of them go away to Almanza, the Royal Artillery base depot at Almanza, to be trained as officers, and they return to when the battery reforms as the regiment reforms as a battery in 7th Medium Regiment, and they get really big guns. Then they love that, not a 25-pounder pipsqueaks. They get the 5.5, one of the greatest guns that the British Army's ever had, by all account. So you could see the story, and with oral history, it doesn't end at the end of the battle. Funnily enough, my book did, the first book, and that's why I didn't like it. You've got to tell us. I'd like to do a book about their prisoner of war experiences, because they're incredibly interested following the story through. You know, you've got all this just drama and excitement. You know, people like Ray Ellis, as I said, becoming a wrestler to earn more, to get more food. Other people in the wood camps, other people in very nasty working camps. So one bloke, Harry Day, the medical orderly, escapes and it stays with the Italians for ages. Because he escapes just before the Italians give up. So it's an ongoing, and then of course the rest of 107 Battery and 7th Medium, they're at El Alamein. They fight all the way through North Africa, as I said. Then they go through Sicily. They fire across the Straits to help Monty get across to, is it Reggio? I think it is Reggio. And then they're taken from there, and they're sent back home, reform as 107 Regiment, and then go all the way from, after about a month, they land after D-Day, and then they go through the rest of the campaign. What a story! Yeah. And some characters like Harold Harper, because he's been badly battered, isn't with them when they're captured. He ends up as a RSM and company battery sergeant major and things, and following an individual like that. And the only thing that rather makes it quite sad is they're all dead. That is a bit of a shaker if you think about it.
No, definitely. I mean, and your book talks of, that people are asking, they obviously are reformed, they go through Normandy as a different personnel, with a few of the originals still there, as you say, some went and got trained. But let's say sort of 3 months or 6 months after this battle, okay, there's the ones who are in prisoner war camps. For them, the war, for you, Tommy, the war is over. But for the regiment, for the battery, how did they look back on this? Because it is a defeat. I mean, they were captured, but it's also a very, there was an epic stand there where every gunner did their absolute best in it. So how did the regiment or the battery kind of mold what experience they faced there and use it kind of for morale of the continuation of the war?
I think they chose to look at it as a success, in the sense of they'd fought to the end.
Yeah, they did their jobs. Yeah,
Daniel said they hadn't, right. But they did. And I know that when they were advancing through the Western Desert again, is it after El Alamein? I do get confused. Yeah, after. Yeah. They go past the site and they go and visit the site, and it's always been, there is a Knightsbridge. What date is it? There's a Knightsbridge dinner that happens on the 6th of June or the nearest Saturday still. It's the current serving unit, which by now is so detached, but there's still a bit of it as a troop that call themselves South Notts Hussars. They're an awesome bunch of lads now as well. I wrote a book about the South Notts Hussars in peacetime because I wanted to follow their story through. And also I was interested in I'm interested in gunnery. I don't want to talk the technicalities of it with you, but I'm interested in how it changes and how the guns move on and how the tactics and so that they get various different jobs. And what a story it is. And yeah, they're very proud of it, but they also see it as a lot of friends dead. So pride, sorrow, those mingled emotions that make up so much of veterans. They're proud of what they've done, but they're sorry for they're sorry for what's happened to their friends. 76 being killed outright, another 16 dying of wounds or as POWs. That's a lot. Or I think it's a lot.
No, it is, and it's reminding ourselves. You said you've done 3 different wars you've been studying and talking about over the last few days. Is that the technology around guns, the observing, the maths, the all that has changed. But ultimately, the job of a gun crew is about the same now as it was several hundred years ago. There's a layer, there's a loader, there's a guy. You sit behind a gun and someone puts a shell in and someone presses the fire button, the shell departs the barrel. That part of it in some ways hasn't really changed, is it?
I think they've got GPSs on the guns now. That does help a bit.
Yes, I know, but some bloke still has to pick a round up and put it in there. Someone still has to, close the breach behind it. So, you could argue the same thing applies to infantrymen. They are still walking around with a rifle and a backpack as they were, years ago. But artillery, I think, is underexplored in terms of personal stories. I think so often historians think about artillery as a tool in the toolbox. We think of the gun. We don't necessarily think about the personnel.
I think that's true. And that's something I very much wanted to correct. It's too late for us in the First World War with our recordings. It was just too late. But we did make a real effort with the South Notts Hussars project to fully record an artillery unit. And what is exposed is how important the guns are. Yeah. And I do feel you do not have to denigrate the contributions of the tanks, the armored corps, or of the infantry. I've just written a book on the armored corps called Burning Steel. I always call it Burning Sausages, but that's because of my mind. It's also and the other book is Foot Sloggers, which is out next week, which is about the 16th DLI. Now, who had the worst time? The infantry. Who had the most terrified time? Probably the people in the tanks. Who actually contributed most to the war efforts? Well, if I was really bound to choose, I'd say that the massed artillery of the medium and heavy guns of the Royal Artillery were an absolute war-winning weapon in 1944-45. But by then, of course, you've got a bigger contribution because the air power sorted itself out with air cooperation, which in 39-40 they bloody well hadn't. But so it's invidious, really, to choose because all 3 of those services have tremendous challenges, and they all contribute a great deal. I'll tell you one thing: you're going nowhere without the infantry. In the sense of the tanks and the artillery can't occupy ground. They can make it very painful to occupy it from the other side.
That's the modern analogy, is it? Not that we're going to be talking about Afghanistan, Iraq, or even Ukraine. A place is not held until some poor son of a bitch has walked through it with a backpack on and a rifle and checked it out. You can have whatever you want in terms of billion-dollar jets flying above it at 15,000 feet and drones. Until some poor guy or fellows have gone through it, a place isn't occupied. And so infantry in that regard are always going to be, the boots on the ground is important.
But as I say, you must remember the importance of the artillery. It is crucial to the survival of it does everything for the infantry to try and protect them from opposing artillery to get them forward. But on the other hand, the tanks are vital as well. I was late in the day to realising that. It was only when I did the project on the 2nd Fife and 4th Fire Yeoman.
No, I mean, when you came on and thought about Burning Steel, didn't you, with that a few months ago? So anything before we wind this one up, obviously I want to have you come on and talk about a Darm Light Infantry, because my best mate here in Normandy, Colin, is a massive DLI fan, and have they 16 battalions or something had around the world in World War II? Well, the biggest regiments in the British Army, weren't they? The regiment, I think, the DLI.
They were fabulous.
And you can come and talk about that.
All my family are from Durham. It's just me. I was born in Luton.
Luton's a bit
parents,
of a come down from Durham, but I mean,
my parents, very, very unwise trip to the south.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Any final things you want to say about the South Notts in North Africa? Any closing thoughts you want to say before we wind this up about what they did or anything that you learned from them?
I think they did their best, and that best was pretty bloody good. And I think I always say it's ordinary men doing extraordinary things. That's what the Second World War is all about.
Brilliant. Well, would you like to give us a little quick, for those who aren't aware of your podcast, give us a little 30-second summary or a minute of what you do for people who've first encountered you here on World War II TV, but want to hear more of your dulcet tones and impressions. Tell us about your podcast.
Well, I do a podcast with a mate of mine called Gary Bain, who used to be the commercial director for Transport for London, is now a historian. He's a very amusing fellow, and together we do a podcast called Pete and Gary's Military History. It tends to be we look at serious topics. There's a lot of history in it, but we try and keep a light touch, as I do always, mainly because I'm incapable of being serious for too long. I really enjoy doing them. We've been doing them for 3 years.
Yeah.
Just like you. I mean,
like
you've been how long since?
We all start 3 years. Yeah, it was that lockdown, COVID. Where would
we'd started the month before, and we thought, wow, the whole world stopped, but we carried on the podcasts. Mainly they were done on Zoom then, of course.
Yeah, Zoom. I mean, it's amazing how
unlike some, we stuck to the rules. I can't think who I'm thinking of today.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Anyway, Peter, it's been fantastic talking to you. We'll make a date for coming on, talk about the 16 DLI, and we'll do
I'd love that.
But folks, we'll be back in tomorrow. We're talking about some of the artillery principles. The History Explorer is on tomorrow to talk about that. So we'll talk about what the role of the forward observers are. So kind of some of the technical side of things as well. And we're going to use the example of Hill 314 in Normandy, where the American 30th Division were Mortain during the counterattack, and how vital forward observers are there. So that's tomorrow's show. So thank you, Peter. Thanks for watching. I will see you all tomorrow.
Thank
Cheers,
you,
everybody. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.